Continuing with our talk on pollination, especially about the biotic pollination, I was talking to you about entomophily, and in entomophily also we are talking about pollination by bees and wasps, which is called as melitophily. I just told you that bees handle about 80% of pollinations and bees are color blind to red. Now, those flowers which are pollinated by bees, they often have markings which are visible in ultraviolet wavelengths, which are called as nectar guides, which help the bees to locate the nectaries. You and me cannot see these these guides, but the bees, they can see those. And all those flowers which are pollinated by bees, they have a sweet, delicate fragrance, and they also produce copious amounts of nectar. Now, in this particular picture, you see honeybee collecting nectar and pollen from Brassica napus. Okay, the flowers of Brassica napus. This is a very common sight in northern part of India, especially during winter, because this Brassica is flowering at that time, and it is actually visited by a huge number of bees. Bee pollinated flowers, they open during the day and they provide a suitable landing platform for the pollinators. Now, there are many types of bees. We have honey bees, bumble bees, orchid bees. Each one of them differs in size, tongue length and pollination behavior. Now, bees can be either solitary or colonial, and they range in size from 2 to 32 millimeter, but the most common bee which we generally see pollinating is about 12 millimeter long. Some plants can be pollinated by bumblebees. Now, plants which are pollinated by bumblebees, they are characteristic in the sense that the pollen is more or less very firmly held by the anthers, and it is not dislodged very easily. So, this happens only in the presence of a bumblebee. The bumblebees, they grab onto the flowers and they vibrate their flight muscles at a certain frequency. This causes dislodging of pollen grains from the anthers, and this is seen in Solanum melongena. Here you can see bumblebee on the on a flower of Solanum. Now, there is one mechanism which is commonly seen in the flowers of salvia. Here you see that there are these bi-lipped corollas of salvia, which is called as the turnpipe mechanism. Turnpipe mechanism in salvia, this is a specialized floral mechanism for bee pollination. It is also called as the staminal lever mechanism. The bi-lipped corollas of salvias, they have two stamens, and each stamen has two lobes which are attached to the corolla tube. The upper lobe of the stamen is fertile and is separated from the lower sterile lobe by an elongated connective tissue. The fertile lobes are under the hood of the upper lip of corolla, and the sterile parts of both the anthers, they join together to form a sterile plate which is placed just above the lower lip of the corolla, and this is actually the place where the bee lands. So, here is another picture. You can see that this is a bee visiting salvia flower where the dorsal thorax is touching the stigma. Actually, the stigma is pulled down when the bee lands on the platform formed by the sterile portion of the anthers. And the pollen mass is also seen here. You can see as a yellow spot very close to the arrow. Now, when an insect lands on the lower lip, the fertile lobe automatically comes down and it touches the back of the bee, and subsequently the pollen grains, they get deposited onto the back of the bee, and when this bee visits any other flower of the same species, it is able to transfer the pollen to the stigma. The flowers of salvia are protandrous, that means the anthers, they mature before the stigma attains maturity. So, the bee is already carrying pollen on its back, and when the stigma matures, it bends down and touches the back of the bee. When it touches the back of the bee, it is able to receive the pollen grains and the pollination is accomplished. Now, Here there are three different pictures where you see this staminal lever mechanism or turnpipe mechanism in salvia. In figure A, there are lever-like stamens. You can see this is the arrow which points to the sterile anther, and the broken arrows basically they indicate how the movement of anthers takes place, because when the bee lands onto the lower anther, then the upper anther, the fertile part of the anther, it is pulled down, and along with that there is also the stigma which is also pulled down. So, in the third or the C picture you can see that stigma is pulled down and it is able to take up the pollen from the back of the bee. Another mechanism which is seen in flowering plant is the fly trap mechanism. Now, fly trap mechanism suggests that the pollination takes place by means of flies, or flies are the agents of pollination. It is commonly seen in Aristolochia. You can see that the flowers are bright and leathery in texture. So, below the perianth there is a small urticle like formation, and there are the two types of sex organs which are present. Pollination by flies is called myophily. The large zygomorphic flowers of Aristolochia, they have perianth, and this consists of 3 united tubular lobes which are dilated at base. Flowers are red brown in color and they have a fleshy texture, and they emit a very characteristic odor of rotten meat. The perianth tube is slippery, and mind it, this perianth tube is lined by downwardly pointing hairs inside, which facilitate the entry of flies into the chamber of the flower. Now, this is like a slide. As a child you would have seen, that when you reach the top of the slide, automatically you are pushed downwards. It is difficult to come up. So, here these downwardly pointed hairs, they help in the movement of fly to the base of the flower. The basal part of perianth tube is swollen and is called utricle. That is where the sex organs are present. So, the fly basically slides down into the flower and reaches the urticle. Now, these downwardly pointed here, they actually restrict the exit of the flies. Urticle is surrounding fused style stigmas, anthers, and these are collectively called gynostegium. Okay. Flies are attracted by the strong odor which I just told you, and they eventually get trapped in this utricle. The exit of flies is prevented by these here. When the stigmas are receptive, that is at the time of anthesis, the fly is almost there, and when the anther dehisces, the thorax of the flies, they becomes loaded with sticky pollen grains. Eventually, the hair on perianth tube, they wither and they facilitate the exit of the flies, because now there are no hair, the fly can actually move out of this flower, and when the same fly visits another flower, it transfers the pollen grains onto the stigma of the other flowers. Now, I have told you about two different mechanisms where one is pollination by flies and other is pollination by bees. So, broadly what we observe is that those species which are pollinated by bees, they have large flowy, showy flowers which are bright in color, and there is also attraction for the flies in terms of nectar and pollen, which is not there in case of other flowers. Now, in these flowers which are pollinated by flies, they do not have a very nice odor or fragrance, they smell like rotten meat, whereas the other ones, they smell nice. Then there is an other type of pollination, which is pollination by moths, and we call it as sphingophily. Moths are predominantly nocturnal, that is, they visit the flowers at night. So, the flowers which are pollinated by moths, they are generally dull yellow or white in color, so that they stand out in the fading or low evening light or at night. Okay, and flowers visiting the flower visiting moths are divided into two. One are the hawk moths, and then there are settling moths. The large ones are the hawk moths and the small ones are the settling moths. Large hawk moths, they often forage by hovering in front of the flowers, and they lap the nectar by their long proboscis. They have high metabolic rate compared to settling moths, and of course then such flowers are usually large, tubular or brush like. Settling moths are small, they fly slowly between flowers and they seek nectar by landing or on walking on inflorescences, which is unlike large hawk moths, which only hover and take up the nectar. So, the flowers which are pollinated by settling moths, these are small and often they are present in aggregate inflorescence. So, I will be talking to you about yucca, which is a classic example of moth pollinated species. Yucca has an obligate pollination mutualism which occurs between the yucca moth, which is a member of Lepidoptera. Yucca moth Tegeticula cannot complete its life cycle without associating with the yucca flowers, and yucca on the other hand, it has no other pollinator. You see the flowers of yucca on the left hand side, and on the right hand side there are the anthers, and you can also see the yucca moths which are present over there. They look very much similar to each other. The adult moth, it pollinates yucca flowers and then her progeny feeds on the developing seeds. Every spring what happens, the adult moths, they emerge from underground cocoons with males and females mating on the yucca plants. When a female is ready to lay eggs, she visits a yucca flower to collect pollen and packs them into ball and sticks it under her head. When the same moth flies off to another yucca flower to lay her eggs inside the ovary, she will scrape a small amount of pollen from the sticky ball and pack it into tiny depressions which are present within the style, and in fact this is how pollination is effected. You see a yucca plant over here. Now when the yucca moth has to leave the flower, it will mark it with a pheromone, and this is an indication to other moths that this particular flower has already been visited. When the eggs hatch, the larvae feed on yucca seeds and later burrow out of fruit. Typically, there are more seeds than the larvae can at any particular time feed on. So, that way the plant is able to maintain its progeny. Another type of pollination is pollination by birds. Ornithophily is what we call that. In this particular slide, you see that in figure A, there is a sunbird which is robbing flowers of Tecomella undulata for nectar, and in the second picture there is a bulbul which is pollinating flowers. Now you would ask that what is the difference between a sunbird robbing flower? Why did I not say that it is pollinating? I would like to mention here that sunbird is visiting the flower only for the nectar. It is not instrumental in carrying out the pollination, whereas bulbul, while it is taking nectar, it is also pollinating the flowers. So, there are many visitors in a flower, and some of them are only there either to eat the pollen or to take the nectar. So, we call them as these are nectar robbing sunbirds which you see here. Okay. Now, over 900 species of birds, they pollinate 500 genera of flowering plants. Such flowers which are pollinated by birds, they are often large because they have to accommodate birds, and they are mostly red or scarlet, because these colors can be noticed by birds from long distances. The flowers can also be orange, yellow, white or violet. Petals are often fused and they form a urn shaped or cup shaped or tubular structure so that the birds can put in their curved beaks and lap up the nectar. Flowers are devoid of any smell or odor, but yes, they have to produce copious amounts of nectar because this is the reward for the birds for which they visit such flowers. Now, those flowers which have generalist pollinators, that means that there are no specific pollinators, they produce more dilute nectar than those having specialist pollinators, you know. Specialist pollinators, I would like to say that there are certain flowers which are pollinated either by sunbirds or hummingbirds or in general by birds. So, where there are specialist pollinators, then the nectar is dense and it is up to the taste of the birds. Pollinating bird species, they can fly long distances and they have a great visual ability and strong spatial memory so that they can, you know, find out where the flowers are, where the flowers are present, and they can remember, you know, where such flowers can be found. Now, here in this picture you see that there is a hummingbird which is pollinating a flower. Now, hummingbirds, they possess long and curved beaks. You see here there is a long and a curved beak, and another thing which you have to notice here in this picture is that the bird is hovering over the flower. The bird is not alighting on the flower. The hovering birds, they collect nectar without landing on the plant. Plant species pollinated by hummingbirds may have hanging or pendant flowers. Flowers are often positioned in such a way so that bird can comfortably feed while hovering. So, the other parts of the plant should not be, you know, brushing onto the bird so that the bird gets hurt. The exact angle of the blooms decides which hummingbird species which pollinate, as different species they have different shapes of their beaks, you know, the bill shapes are different. Now, here there is a sunbird which is pollinating a flower of Cydinus. You can see that the bird is very much perched and then it is pollinating. Unlike hummingbirds, the perching birds, they can land on stems, leaf stalks, adjacent branches or the flowers which are close by. Flowers and inflorescences of plants pollinated by these birds are typically sturdier because the bird has to literally land on them, and such flowers, they have more sclerenchyma and collenchyma present in them, and flowers are typically they are long, tubular, they can be red to orange in color. The birds, they land on appropriate spots from where they can easily take up the nectar by dipping their sharp bills or beaks into the top of the flowers and inserting their brush tipped tongues deep down to the bottom of the flower. Perching is a more widespread foraging mechanism than hovering, because hovering is a difficult kind of a mechanism, you know. And another biotic pollination which we will talk about now is pollination by bats. You can see a frugivore bat, that is the ones which feed on fruits. It is feasting on nectar. You can see, I think you can all identify, it is a Bombyx ceiba flower. Bombyx ceiba is also called as the ceiba pentandra. During foraging, the pollen grains, they get deposited onto the fur or the snout of the bat, and when it visits the next flower, they will be probably transferred and then the pollination will occur. Bat pollination is also prevalent in Adansonia digitata and Bauhinia species. Bats navigate and search in dark, and they send out high pitched calls and they listen to the echoes that bounce back. They have an elongated rostrum, reduced dentition and a long tongue which helps them to collect nectar. Bat pollinated plants are mostly tree species And what is very characteristic here is that the flowers or the inflorescence, it is always projecting away from the canopy, or it is above the canopy, it is suspended on long stalks, and so that bats can easily visit the flowers. It does not get caught into the branches and the leaves network of a tree. The flowers are large and tubular, and they often have a very shaving brush type of shape. Here you see there are two pictures. The first one, we can see that they are large and tubular brush like flowers which the bat is visiting, and the second picture shows a tube lipped nectar bag. This kind of a tube helps the bat to take up the nectar from the species flowers. Flowers, obviously, because they are pollinated at night, they are either white or green in color, they have a wide opening and they emit a very musty odor whenever they open at night. Okay, it can be fetid also. Sometimes it is mildly pleasant. Flowers produce large volumes of hexose rich nectar. It's about 15 ml per flower per night. Because the bats are very active metabolically, one single bat makes around 80 to 100 flower visits per night. So you can imagine the amount of nectar these bats are going to consume. They use smell echolocation to find flowers, and they depend on their excellent spatial memory to visit same trees repeatedly. Their long narrow tongues, they enable them to reach the lowest part of the flower wherever the nectar is concealed, and they can take up the nectar from there. Besides nectar, they also consume and digest the pollen grains, and sometimes they even lap up whatever insects are present in the flowers. Here what you see in this picture is a snail which is present in the flower of Volvulopsis. It is called as melacophily, that is pollination by snails. Now melacophily, pollination by snails, is a rare phenomenon and it has been reported in Volvulopsis. Now in Volvulopsis also, majority of the pollination is carried out by bees, but sometimes when the bees are not active, especially when there is lot of rain, then the snails are the exclusive pollinators. You would have seen that snails are very active on rainy days, whereas bees would have found shelter somewhere else. Some more unusual pollinators which I am not going to discuss right now, but yes, which we know of as pollinators are the marsupials, the primates, the rodents, and sometimes there are even lizards which are known to pollinate different plant species. Now I would like to mention here that depending on the type of the pollinator, the flowers, they have adapted themselves, you know, the color of the flower, the size of the flower, the shape, like for bird pollinated species, the flowers are in the form of a tube, right, so that the birds can put in their beaks inside. So, summing up what I have talked to you right now, we have biotic pollination and we have abiotic pollination. Biotic pollination is carried out by living organisms, and these living organisms can be bees, birds, moths, butterflies, bats, ants, etc. 80% of all pollination is carried out by biotic agents. It is dependent on the availability of pollinators. Now, when you go back into the history, we have read that during Permian time, you know, that time the angiosperms had not even appeared at that time, but at that time what was there was that in the fossil records people have seen that the gymnosperm pollen have been found in the guts of insects, right. So that means insects were actually the only pollinators which were available. Now just starting, before starting this lecture, I told you that when there were strong wind currents, there was strong air which was blowing, that time the smell, which is a cue for pollination for the pollinators, that was getting diluted, and that time wind became one of the agencies of pollination. Before that it used to be biotic pollinators only, right, which were there. And then flowers of all species which are pollinated by biotic agencies, they are generally bright, and they also have to produce copious amounts of nectar and pollen, because why would a bird or a bee or any other insect or a wasp or whatever butterfly will visit a flower? They visit not to pollinate, actually their aim is to visit to have food. The nectar or the pollen, they act as a reward for the pollinators. Another important thing here is that those species which are biotically pollinated, there the flowers are sturdy, they are large, and sometimes they are leathery, like I showed you the Aristolochia flower, so as to allow the pollinator to land on them, especially bird pollinated species where the birds, they perch onto the flowers and they lap up the nectar. Seba pentandra, Butea monosperma, Alstonia are some of the common examples of species which are pollinated by biotic agencies. Now always remember that whenever there is a biotic agent for pollination, the flowers have to be large, they have to be bright, they have to produce copious amounts of nectar, pollen, and most of the times the pollen here are they have a high nutrient content. They are also sticky, so that they can easily stick onto the body parts or the mouth parts of the pollinator, and the flowers have to be sturdy and they have to be brightly colored so that they attract different pollinators. On the contrary, there is abiotic pollination which is carried out by non-living agencies. Now, I have already mentioned that these non-living agencies are wind and water which carry out the pollination. Now, 80% of the pollinations are carried out by biotic agencies, the 20% pollinations are carried out by abiotic agencies, and these abiotic pollinations are not dependent on the availability of pollinators. So, I can say that abiotic pollination is not constrained by the availability of pollinators. Now, because they do not want any biotic pollinator, so they really don't invest in odor, nectar or pollen. Flowers are generally dull in color and they are very ornate. There is minimal perianth which is present. The flowers are positioned in such a manner so that easily the pollen are dispersed. Now both types of abiotic pollinations, whether they are wind or water, they are inherently wasteful processes, because the pollination here takes place in 3 dimensions. In wind also it's the same, and in water also we have a 3rd dimension of volume which is there. Pollen can go haywire, they can travel in all directions. So the plant really has to invest a lot in producing huge quantities of pollen grains which are non-sticky and which are dry. In contrast to pollen in biotic species, pollinated by biotic species, where they are large and they are sticky, right. And abiotic pollination, there is absence of nectar, there is reduction in perianth parts, stigmas, anthers. They do not need to attract pollinators, and commonly seen in Helianthus, Vallisneria, Zostera are some of the common examples. I hope you have understood all the concepts of pollination, and in the next class we will continue with fertilization. Thank you very much.